Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
It was in the early days of November in the year 89 that I once more found myself drawn into the extraordinary orbit of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The night air of London hung thick with fog, curling in ghostly tendrils around the lamplights of Baker Street. Within the familiar warmth of our sitting room, the violin lay silent upon its stand, and Holmes sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, his long fingers steepled, eyes half closed in a meditation that seemed to absorb the very hush of the fire. It was in such moments of perfect stillness that the outside world intruded most violently. The knocker downstairs sounded thrice, sharp, urgent, and accompanied by the faint tremor of wheels halting in the street. Mrs. Hudson's steps, rapid and anxious, preceded the arrival of a visitor who burst through our door without the usual ceremony. He was a tall, narrow-shouldered man in the uniform of a Scotland Yard inspector, Inspector Gregory, a capable officer whose acquaintance we had made in the affair of the Boscombe Valley mystery. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly, "I've just come from the South Bank. There's a business there that'll tax even your talents, I'd wager." Holmes regarded him mildly, as one might study a curious specimen of insect life. "Pray, take a seat, Inspector. You appear to have brought with you not only the chill of the river, but something of its turbulence." Gregory gave a short nod. "A man's been found dead in an abandoned workshop off the Lambeth Wharf. Name of Percival Trent, a mechanical draftsman by trade. There's something confounded queer about it. No sign of struggle, no weapon, no footprints but his own, yet the man's neck bears a small puncture wound scarcely wider than a pin." Holmes' eyes flickered open. "A puncture wound, you say?" "Yes, clean, deliberate, like a needle's mark, but there's not a trace of poison, nor any explanation for how it was done. And yet, the man's face—" Gregory hesitated, lowering his voice. "It was frozen in the most dreadful expression of terror." A faint smile ghosted across Holmes's lips. "The needle's path," he murmured, as though naming a tune he had long forgotten. I started. "You know the phrase, Holmes?" He waved his hand lightly. "Merely an association of ideas, my dear Watson. But tell me, Inspector, what prompted you to come to me rather than your able colleagues at the Yard?" "Because," said Gregory grimly, "the door was locked from the inside, and the only window barred with iron. And yet, someone left a calling card upon the workbench." He reached into his coat and drew out a small square of ivory paper. Upon it was written, in precise copperplate script, "For every design, a needle, for every truth, a thread." Holmes took the card delicately between his fingers, studying it as though it were a rare mineral specimen. "Curious," he said softly. "Very curious indeed. I believe, Inspector, you may have done well to come to Baker Street tonight." He rose abruptly, the languor of moments before vanishing in an instant. His eyes gleamed with that singular light I had come to recognize, the light of the hunt. "Watson," he said, reaching for his coat and hat, "the game, as our old friend Lestrade would say, is afoot." The hansom cab rattled through the misty streets, the clatter of hooves echoing against the narrow stone facades as we made our way south toward the river. Holmes sat opposite me, the brim of his hat shadowing his sharp eyes, his fingers drumming lightly upon the sill in a rhythm I had long learned to associate with intense thought. Inspector Gregory, beside him, leaned forward anxiously, his gloved hands clasped upon his knees. "You will find the matter in a perplexing state, Mr. Holmes," said Gregory. "The door was bolted from within, and we had to force entry. The man lay beside his work table, a look of horror on his face, as though he'd seen the devil himself." "Indeed," murmured Holmes. "And what of this Mr. Trent? You said he was a draftsman." "A fine one, mechanical designer for Whitby and Sons, the clockmakers. He rented that workshop privately, used it for his own inventions. Quiet sort, unmarried, kept mostly to himself. The neighbors heard nothing until the constable passed by after midnight and noticed a faint light burning through the shutters." Holmes nodded, saying nothing further, but I could see his attention sharpen with every word. His keen grey eyes shifted to the fog swirling beyond the window. "A locked room, a dead man, and a wound no larger than a needle," he mused. "It would seem the river's mists have conspired to cloak a very singular crime." The cab drew up before a row of derelict warehouses that leaned toward the Thames like tired sentinels. A dim gas lamp flickered near the entrance, its glow reflecting off the wet cobblestones. Gregory led the way, and Holmes followed swiftly, his gait brisk, his expression taut with curiosity. Inside, the air was cold and metallic, heavy with the smell of oil and iron filings. The workshop was a modest affair. One long table crowded with mechanical parts, diagrams pinned to the walls, and a narrow cot in the corner. The corpse lay upon the floor near the table, a man of perhaps 35, his eyes wide open, his lips drawn back as if caught mid-scream. Holmes crouched beside him, examining the neck with his magnifying lens. "There you see," said Gregory, pointing, "just below the jawline. Barely a mark, yet the man's heart ceased instantly, the surgeon says." Holmes leaned closer, his expression unreadable, a puncture as clean as a surgeon's needle, and no sign of bruising or force. "Remarkable. Watson, your medical eye? What do you make of it?" I bent beside Holmes and studied the wound. "It is indeed narrow, too narrow, perhaps, for a knife. The edges are neat, not torn. Were it not for the discoloration, I might have taken it for an injection site. Yet if poison was the cause, none has been found." Gregory shook his head. "The Yard's chemist tested for the usual suspects: strychnine, morphine, cyanide. Nothing." Holmes rose and paced slowly around the room. No weapon, no sign of entry or exit, no disturbance, only the card, which lay neatly upon the bench beside him. He glanced toward the scattered blueprints upon the wall, his gaze halting. Upon one in particular, a complex design of gears and needles radiating from a central spindle. He plucked it from the wall and studied it intently. "Watson, observe. The title reads Thread Tension Regulator Mark II. A curious mechanism, wouldn't you agree?" I stepped closer. The drawing depicted what appeared to be a clockwork device, its motion driven by a delicate spiral spring. "Something related to textile machinery, perhaps?" I suggested. Holmes smiled faintly. "Or something far subtler. Note the precision of the measurements, down to the 100th of an inch. This Trent fellow was no mere tinkerer. He was building something with purpose." Gregory frowned. "But what connection has that to his death?" "That," Holmes replied, "is precisely what we must determine. Let us reconstruct as best we can his final hours." He moved methodically about the room, eyes darting from object to object. The scattered screws on the floor, the half-finished sketches. A single candle burned nearly to the base. Then he halted before the window. "Observe, Watson, the soot upon the sill, yet no corresponding mark upon the floor beneath it. The window has not been opened recently, yet the soot is disturbed. That suggests a draft from the chimney or ventilation duct, not from without." He crossed swiftly to a small vent in the far corner and knelt before it. A faint metallic glint caught his eye. Producing his tweezers, he drew forth a narrow fragment of wire, scarcely thicker than a hair, tipped with a minute bead of glass. "Ha!" he exclaimed softly. "Now this is most illuminating." Gregory leaned in. "What on earth is it?" Holmes turned the object delicately in the lamplight. "A filament, Inspector. Possibly part of an instrument or device, a delivery mechanism, I should think. And here, this residue. See the shimmer." He held it close to my view. "Watson, I believe we are looking at the remnant of a fine, hollow needle." "You mean the wound?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "The fatal puncture corresponds in depth and diameter. This is not a murder by chance. It is the work of an ingenious mind, one accustomed to precision and concealment." He replaced the filament carefully and examined the floorboards beneath the table. "Curious. There are faint marks here, scratches, concentric, as though a heavy object had been rotated repeatedly. Perhaps a mechanism was stationed here and later removed." Gregory ran a hand through his hair. "Then someone dismantled the murder weapon and carried it off. But how if the door was locked?" Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful. "That, Inspector, is the heart of the matter. Either the room was never truly sealed, or the killer found a way to depart without crossing the threshold." We stood in silence, the sound of the river faint through the walls. Holmes drew his pipe from his pocket, though he did not light it, merely turning it in his fingers, as though measuring the weight of his thoughts. Trent was working on a regulator, perhaps for sewing or measuring tension. The message upon the card speaks of needle and thread. We may be looking at more than poetic metaphor. Gregory eyed him uneasily. You think there's some hidden meaning? Holmes gave a short. At that moment there came a sharp knock upon the door. One of the constables entered, his face pale in the dim light. Beg pardon, Inspector. There's a gentleman here, Mr. Alfred Whitby of Whitby & Sons. Says he was Mr. Trent's employer and insists on seeing the body. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Excellent. Let us hear what Mr. Whitby has to say. The dead often speak best through the living. As the constable departed to fetch him, Holmes moved once more to the table, his gaze falling upon a smudge of oil beside the card. He took out his lens and examined it minutely. Then quite suddenly he gave a quiet chuckle. Watson, he murmured, if I am not very much mistaken, the first thread of this tapestry has just revealed itself. I leaned forward, my curiosity burning. What have you found, Holmes? He smiled cryptically. Only the faintest impression of a fingerprint, yet it is inverted, as though made by a left hand that never touched the table at all. Before I could question him further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor. The door opened and a man entered, middle-aged, stout, with a face both refined and weary. His eyes darted nervously between the corpse and the detectives. Mr. Whitby, I presume, said Holmes, bowing slightly. You come at a most opportune moment. There is much I wish to ask you about the late Mr. Trent, and about a certain design he called the Needle's Path. The man froze, his face draining of colour. For a moment he seemed incapable of speech. Then in a voice that trembled faintly he said, So you've seen it then? God help us all, Mr. Holmes, he wasn't supposed to finish it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, he said softly, then the design was completed. Whitby hesitated, his breath shallow. Completed and destroyed. So we thought. Holmes's smile was thin and dangerous. Then, my dear sir, it appears someone has taken great pains to prove you wrong. For a long moment the only sound in the workshop was the faint hiss of the gas lamp. Holmes regarded the trembling man before him with a composure that seemed almost inhuman. Mr. Alfred Whitby's hand rested upon the back of a chair, his knuckles white, his eyes darting toward the lifeless figure of Percival Trent, as though he feared it might rise at any moment. Holmes motioned him gently toward a seat. Compose yourself, Mr. Whitby, he said in a tone that was calm but commanding. The living have more need of our attention tonight than the dead. You said the device was completed and destroyed. Pray enlighten us. Whitby sank heavily into the chair, removing his hat with a trembling hand. It was nearly 3 months ago, he began, his voice low. Trent came to me with a design unlike anything we'd ever produced. He called it a precision regulator, a contrivance for maintaining absolute control of thread tension in textile machinery. He said it could revolutionize the field, but there was something in his manner, an excitement bordering on obsession. He wouldn't allow anyone to see the final mechanism, not even me. When I pressed him, he became evasive, even secretive. Eventually, he withdrew from the company altogether and set up this private workshop. Holmes listened intently, his chin resting upon one long finger. And you believed the design destroyed? Whitby nodded miserably. We feared legal entanglements. The board decided to abandon the project and Trent agreed, or so he said. He handed over a single prototype, which I personally disassembled and cast into the furnace. After that he seemed calmer, more rational. I thought the matter closed until tonight, murmured Holmes. Whitby shuddered. Yes, when the constable came to fetch me, I scarcely believed it. But when I saw the name and the address, my heart sank. That machine of his. I always feared it might prove dangerous. There was something unnatural about it. Unnatural in what sense? I asked. Whitby hesitated. He spoke once of applying mechanical principles to the human form, of motion so delicate that it could imitate life itself. I laughed at the notion, thinking it a fancy. But there was a look in his eyes I did not like. As though he meant to test it. Holmes leaned forward. You suspect, then, that this contrivance might have had some more sinister use? Whitby spread his hands helplessly. I do not know, Mr. Holmes. All I can tell you is that Trent was brilliant but unstable. A man consumed by his work, driven by forces I never understood. If this Needle's Path you speak of was one of his experiments, then God alone knows what it was meant to do. Holmes rose, pacing slowly about the room, his gaze sweeping over every detail. I could almost hear the whir of his mind as he pieced together the fragments of information. Whitby's trembling confession, the peculiar puncture wound, the missing mechanism. "Watson," he said suddenly, "observe the lamp upon the bench. Do you notice anything peculiar about its construction?" I moved closer. "The glass chimney is thickened at the base and the flame sits lower than usual." "Precisely. A modification. And see here, this narrow copper tube leading away beneath the table. It passes through the floorboards into the chamber below." Holmes crouched, tracing the pipe with his fingers until it disappeared through a small aperture. "Inspector, is the cellar accessible?" Gregory frowned. "It's locked, but the constable has the key." "Then by all means," said Holmes quietly, "let us descend." The steps creaked as we made our way downward, the air growing damp and chill. The cellar was little more than a stone vault, half filled with discarded machinery and coils of wire. Holmes's lantern cut a sharp beam across the floor, revealing a tangle of gears and rods, and in the midst of them, a circular iron base scorched and rusted, as though some contraption had been hastily dismantled. "There," he said softly, "the missing centerpiece." Gregory approached cautiously. "What in heaven's name is it?" Holmes knelt beside the wreckage, his fingers brushing over the metal grooves. "A mechanical platform of some kind. Note the grooves along the circumference. They match the scratches I observed above. Whatever was mounted here revolved upon this base. And this," he pointed to a fine coiled spring, "is no part of a loom. It's a recoil mechanism. Gentlemen, I believe Mr. Trent was constructing a device capable of firing a hollow needle with clockwork precision." Whitby gave a cry of horror. "You mean a weapon?" Holmes did not look up. "Not in the conventional sense. A silent weapon. One that could deliver death without sound or visible force. A mechanism triggered remotely, perhaps even by the very lamp above us. I felt a chill run through me. Then Trent may have been the victim of his own invention?" Holmes rose slowly. "That is a possibility, Watson, though not the only one. There is intelligence behind this scene, too deliberate, too composed. The message left upon the card suggests purpose, not accident." He turned toward Whitby, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "Tell me, Mr. Whitby, who else knew of this design?" The man swallowed hard. "No one beyond the board. Myself, Mr. Elgar, our financial director, and Miss Lydia Trent, Percival's sister. She kept his notes after he resigned." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "A sister. Does she reside in London?" "Yes, Hampstead, near Fitzjohn's Avenue. But she's unwell. Nervous disposition, they say." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with Gregory. "Inspector, I suggest you send a constable to watch her house discreetly. I have a feeling Miss Trent may hold the thread that connects this entire affair." Gregory nodded and went upstairs to give the order. When his footsteps faded, Holmes turned to me, lowering his voice. "Watson, recall the filament we found in the vent. The glass-tipped wire. The residue upon it was crystalline, not metallic. I suspect it may have been coated with an alkaloid compound, one that acts upon the nervous system instantaneously. We shall have it analyzed, but I would wager the true cause of Trent's death lies there. And you think someone used his own device against him?" I asked. Holmes's expression hardened. "I think, my dear Watson, that we are dealing with a mind equal in precision to Trent's own, but darker in intention. The murderer must have known how to operate the mechanism, how to trigger it without leaving trace or entry. Such knowledge implies not theft, but collaboration." Whitby looked up sharply. "You mean someone from within the company?" Holmes regarded him coolly. "We shall see. But for now, Mr. Whitby, I would advise you to guard whatever remains of Trent's designs. Destroy them if you have the authority. There are hands in London capable of dreadful ingenuity when guided by greed." We ascended again to the workshop, where the faint light of dawn had begun to creep through the shutters. Holmes stood by the window, watching the grey mist roll across the river. "Watson," he said quietly, "does it not strike you as singular that a draftsman should die by a needle, and that his final creation should vanish into thin air?" "It suggests intention," I replied. He nodded. "Exactly. The assassin wished us to see the symbol, the needle as both instrument and message. It is artistry of a macabre sort." Just then a constable entered with a note for Gregory. The inspector read it quickly and turned pale. "It's from the man I sent to Hampstead," he said. Miss Lydia Trent was found unconscious in her study an hour ago. Same puncture wound at the neck. Still alive, but barely. Holmes's eyes flared with sudden energy. Come, Watson, there is no time to lose. The pattern is repeating itself. The needle strikes again. Within moments, we were in the street once more, the cab waiting where we'd left it. As it lurched forward into the mist, Holmes sat upright, every trace of languor gone from his face. This, Watson, he said, has ceased to be a case of mere deduction. We are racing against a design so intricate that even the smallest delay may prove fatal. The question is no longer who killed Percival Trent, but who now holds the thread of the needle's path in their hand. And as the cab wheels clattered over the cobblestones, I could not shake the feeling that, for the first time in our long acquaintance, even Holmes himself was not entirely certain where that thread might lead. The drive to Hampstead was swift but silent, each of us absorbed in the dark possibilities that lay ahead. The morning fog had thickened once more, shrouding the city in a dull pallor that seemed to muffle even the sound of the horses' hooves. Holmes sat rigid, his eyes fixed upon the shifting streets beyond the cab window. His mind, I knew, was working through the countless permutations of the problem with that uncanny rapidity that often left me breathless in its wake. When we arrived at Fitzjohn's Avenue, we found the scene already in controlled confusion. A constable stood guard by the garden gate of a modest yet elegant townhouse, while a doctor's carriage waited by the curb. The front door stood ajar, and inside we could hear the low murmur of anxious voices. Holmes strode up the path, his coat sweeping behind him, and presented his card to the constable, who ushered us through at once. Miss Lydia Trent was lying upon a chaise in the drawing-room, her face pale as linen, her auburn hair damp with perspiration. A middle-aged physician knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers against her wrist. "Pulse faint," he muttered, but steadying somewhat. "The wound is small, though curious, no ordinary puncture." Holmes was at his side in an instant. "Might I?" he asked softly, and without waiting for assent he examined the mark upon the woman's neck. The same faint red puncture, barely visible, marred the smooth skin below the ear. He sniffed lightly near the wound, then straightened, his expression unreadable. A slight odor of oil. Machine oil, not medicinal. "Precisely as I suspected," he turned to the physician. "Doctor, your patient must remain under constant watch. She has been attacked by a means we are only beginning to understand." "Has she spoken since being found?" "Barely," the man replied. "A few words, nonsense perhaps. She said it followed the pattern, and then lost consciousness again." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Followed the pattern. Curious indeed." He moved to the writing desk near the window, where a stack of papers lay scattered. Among them were sketches, intricate mechanical drawings, each depicting variations of circular designs, intersected by lines like threads upon a spindle. Across one was scrawled a title in a delicate hand, "The Needle's Path, Final Draft." "Watson," Holmes murmured, gesturing to me. "So observe the precision here, each movement calculated to the fraction of an inch. Trent was perfecting something far beyond a textile regulator. This mechanism is designed for accuracy under the smallest margin of error. See these apertures along the outer ring? They could easily house retractable filaments, needles if you will, each controlled by a rotating core." Gregory, who had arrived behind us, frowned. Then she must have known of it. Perhaps she was helping her brother. "Or guarding him," Holmes said absently, riffling through the papers. "There is an intellect here equal to his. Look at the notations, alterations in ink of a different shade. These are Lydia's corrections, not his." The inspector's brow furrowed. "You mean she continued his work after his death?" Holmes looked up sharply. "No, Inspector. She continued it before his death." A silence fell over the room. The implication hung between us like a whisper in the fog. Holmes turned once more toward the chaise, studying the woman's still form. Her involvement was deeper than we assumed. Whether she was collaborator or victim, I have yet to determine. But the timing of this attack suggests the latter. Someone fears what she knows. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides and examined the window. "Locked from within," he muttered. "And here see the faint mark upon the sill, a small metal impression circular, no larger than a coin." He bent closer, drawing out his magnifying lens. "A suction ring, Watson. The same as used in mechanical clamps. Something was fixed here, perhaps momentarily. And here, this trace of soot along the hinge indicates a tube or wire once connected." Gregory scratched his chin. You think the weapon was mounted outside? Holmes smiled faintly. Mounted? No, suspended. He gestured toward the garden where the branches of a tall elm brushed the window's edge. The killer, it seems, is fond of distance, of precision without proximity. He uses the mechanism as an extension of his will. A machine cannot be questioned, nor does it leave a boot print. Ingenious, if it were not so diabolical. I glanced toward the unconscious woman. Then whoever attacked her had access to both her home and her brother's workshop. That implies someone within their circle, Holmes nodded. Precisely. And that circle, Watson, grows smaller with every clue. We have Whitby, the financial director, Mr. Elgar, and Miss Trent. 3 names and a secret design that has already claimed 2 victims. He fell silent, his gaze drifting once more to the papers. His hand hovered over one sketch in particular, marked with a faint smudge of oil. This symbol, he said quietly, is repeated on Trent's blueprint, the concentric circles connected by a single diagonal line. To most, it would appear an engineer's flourish, but to the observant eye it forms the letter A, stylized, concealed. Tell me, Watson, what better signature could an inventor leave than his own? An A, I repeated slowly. You think it refers to Alfred Whitby? Holmes' lips curved in a smile that was neither confirmation nor denial. It is a hypothesis, one among many, but note the elegance of it. The very man who claimed to have destroyed the design may well have preserved it. There is artistry in concealment, and Mr. Whitby strikes me as a man who appreciates both profit and discretion. At that moment, a faint sound escaped from the chaise, a weak gasp, followed by a whisper. Holmes was beside Miss Trent in an instant. Her eyelids fluttered, and she looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. He said the pattern was wrong, she murmured. He said it must be corrected. Before it breaks, Holmes leaned closer. Who, Miss Trent? Who said this? Her lips trembled. The man from the boardroom. The one with the gold ring. Her breath faltered. Tell my brother. I tried to stop him. She sank back into silence, her hand falling limp against the coverlet. The physician checked her pulse and nodded. Alive but unconscious again. Holmes straightened, his expression grim. The man with the gold ring. Watson, do you recall whether our friend Mr. Whitby wore such an adornment? I did not notice one. Nor did I, he murmured. But I did observe a faint indentation upon his glove, where one might be worn habitually. Interesting, and if it were not Whitby, then perhaps Mr. Elgar, the financial director, a man likely to display such ornamentation. Gregory sighed. You mean to confront him? Not yet, said Holmes. There is a pattern here, Inspector, and until it is complete we must not disturb the weave. The next move will not be ours, it will be his. He moved toward the door, his long shadow stretching across the room. Watson, remain here a while. See that Miss Trent is safely tended to. I must pay a visit to Whitby and Sons, and examine precisely what manner of device has been destroyed. If my suspicions prove correct, then this case may involve more than murder. It may involve the birth of a machine designed for it. With that, he swept out into the dim morning light, the fog swallowing his figure as he disappeared down the path. I watched him go, my heart heavy with unease. For the first time since the affair began, I sensed that the great detective was not merely pursuing a criminal mind. He was following the invisible hand of invention itself, a creation so precise and pitiless that it threatened to turn reason into death. And somewhere in the distance, faint as a whisper, a clock struck 8, the sound, sharp as a needle piercing through the quiet. Holmes's sharp gaze lingered on the remnants of the parchment, as if the faint traces of ink and creases themselves were whispering secrets. He leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together in that characteristic steeple that marked the dawn of deduction. The lamplight flickered faintly over his angular features, the shadows deepening the lines of concentration across his brow. The path, Watson, he murmured softly, almost to himself. It is not metaphorical. Our visitor, whether conscious of it or not, has left us with something literal. A direction. A needle's path is linear, yet fine, precise, and almost invisible to the untrained eye. Before I could inquire further, Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing, his robe trailing behind him. We must return to the shop on Bramble Lane, he declared. The bookbinder's workshop, where the letter originated, will no doubt hold the thread we seek. It was nearing 10:30 when we arrived once more at the quiet lane. The fog had thickened, curling around the dim gas lamps like ghostly serpents. The shop stood as before, modest and unassuming, its windows dimly lit by a solitary candle burning within. Mr. Pembroke, the bookbinder, received us with a weary nod. "Inspector Lestrade has already paid me a visit," he said, wringing his hands. But I told him I know nothing of this needle's path, as he called it. I only bound the ledger as instructed. Plain calfskin, red thread along the inner spine, as requested by Mr. Ashcroft himself. Red thread? Holmes's tone sharpened with sudden interest. An unusual choice for a financial ledger, wouldn't you agree? Pembroke blinked. "Aye, sir." But he insisted, said it was his family's tradition, though I found that rather odd. Holmes moved toward the counter, his eyes sweeping across the tools of the trade, awls, glue pots, scissors, and spools of thread. His hand paused above one spool, the faintest smile forming on his lips. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe this. Each spool bears a maker's mark, Merrington and Cowan's, all but one." Indeed, one spool stood out, a slender roll of thread, finer than the rest, and tinted with a subtle crimson sheen that was unlike any common dye. "This thread," Holmes continued, holding it up to the light, "is no ordinary bookbinder's material. It has been coated with silk varnish, a treatment used to preserve embroidery rather than paper. Tell me, Mr. Pembroke, did Mr. Ashcroft provide this spool himself?" The bookbinder frowned, his memory visibly straining. "Why, yes, come to think of it, he did. Brought it in a little wooden case, said he wished the binding to have a more personal touch." Holmes nodded curtly, his expression thoughtful. "A personal touch indeed. You have been most helpful, Mr. Pembroke. I must ask to keep this." Before the man could protest, Holmes slipped the thread into his pocket and motioned for me to follow. Once we were outside in the fog-laden air, I could no longer contain my curiosity. "Holmes, what possible significance can a spool of thread hold? Surely there are more direct leads. The clerk who vanished, the empty cellar, the missing volumes." "My dear Watson," Holmes interrupted, a gleam in his eyes, "threads are the foundation of both fabric and fate. Follow one carefully, and it may lead you to the weaver's hand. This particular one," he added, "is treated with a substance known to me, a varnish derived from cochineal and linseed, produced exclusively by a firm in Prague. And I happen to recall that our late Mr. Ashcroft's bank conducted an unusually high number of overseas transactions, several involving a shipping firm by the name of Crowell and Sons, based in that very city." "You mean to say this case extends beyond London?" I asked in astonishment. "Perhaps not geographically, Watson, but intellectually, undoubtedly so. Whoever orchestrated this scheme took great pains to conceal their path. We are merely tugging at the first thread." As we made our way back toward Baker Street, Holmes seemed lost in silent calculation. I could tell from the narrowing of his eyes and the faint tapping of his fingers against his walking stick that his mind was reconstructing the puzzle piece by piece. Upon our return, he wasted no time in retrieving a small vial from his cabinet and dipping the red thread into it. The liquid turned faintly cloudy, then clear again, leaving behind a faint residue. Holmes smiled grimly. "Exactly as I thought. Resin varnish with a trace of arsenic sulfide. A preservative, yes, but also an ink stabilizer for secret correspondence." "Secret correspondence?" I repeated, leaning closer. He gestured toward the faded parchment still lying upon the desk. "The parchment was written with disappearing ink, Watson. The heat from the fireplace earlier today erased what remained. Yet some traces may yet be recovered." He placed the parchment over a small lamp, letting the warmth coax out faint patterns. Slowly, ghostly letters emerged, fragments of words barely legible. "Shipment, Needle's Path, Dock 11, tonight." Holmes's expression grew taut. "We are not the only ones aware of the importance of that phrase. Watson, there is little time to lose. Fetch your coat. We must pay a visit to the river docks before midnight." The cold air struck us as we emerged once more into the London night. The fog had thickened to the point where even the gas lamps struggled to pierce it. Our hansom cab rattled through the near-deserted streets, wheels clattering against cobblestones slick with dew. At last, the cab came to a halt near the Thames, where warehouses loomed like sleeping beasts in the dark. The faint sound of waves lapping against the pilings mingled with the distant clang of chains. Holmes motioned for silence and crouched low behind a stack of wooden crates. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a faint glimmer of lantern light further along the quay. Dock 11. Note the figure pacing near the water. He matches the description Pembroke gave of Ashcroft's assistant. We watched in silence as the man checked his pocket watch, then gestured toward two others emerging from the shadows. They carried what appeared to be a long wooden case, too slender for cargo, yet too deliberate to be ordinary. Holmes's voice was a breath. "The Needles Path, Watson." Not a phrase at all, but a code for transport. "That case contains the instrument of their crime." He rose suddenly, stepping forward from the gloom. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said with icy politeness. "Might I inquire as to the contents of your consignment?" The startled men froze. One of them bolted for the riverbank, but Holmes was already in pursuit. I followed close behind, the fog swallowing us in chaotic swirls as shouts echoed through the night. When we finally cornered the fleeing man by the edge of the wharf, Holmes seized his arm and tore open the wooden case he carried. Inside lay an intricate contraption of brass and steel, a slender, hollow needle attached to a clockwork mechanism. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "A mechanical syringe," he said quietly, "designed for the most precise of poisons. The Needles Path, indeed." The man struggled in vain as constables, summoned earlier by Holmes through Lestrade, emerged from the mist to take him into custody. But as Holmes turned back toward the river, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow detaching itself from the gloom, vanishing into the fog before a single word could be exchanged. Holmes watched it go, his expression unreadable. "The hand that guided this plot is still at large, Watson. Tonight, we have only uncovered the mechanism. Tomorrow we shall seek the mind behind it." The fog still lingered over the Thames when we returned to Baker Street in the early hours of the morning. The constables had carted away the detained man, one Henry Larch according to his papers, while Holmes had instructed Lestrade to keep the entire affair from the newspapers until further notice. The strange mechanical device had been secured, wrapped in a heavy oilcloth, and brought back to Holmes's table for examination. Holmes worked in silence, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his thin hands moving deftly as he dismantled the brass contraption piece by piece. The faint click of tiny gears and the soft scrape of metal filled the sitting room. I could see from the sharpness in his expression that each component revealed something new to him, though he spoke not a word for nearly half an hour. At last he exhaled sharply and leaned back. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The precision of German manufacture, yet the design bears a distinctly bohemian influence. See here, Watson, these grooves along the needle's interior. The liquid would travel not by pressure, but by capillary action. A drop of poison, enough to kill a man instantly, delivered with mathematical accuracy. I examined the disassembled device as best I could, though it was beyond my medical understanding. But for what purpose would such a tool be built? It is hardly the weapon of a common criminal." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Indeed, not common. This, my dear Watson, is an instrument of subtlety, a murderer's pen, not a soldier's blade. The mechanism suggests deliberate engineering, the work of someone with scientific training and a flair for precision. There is intent in every rivet and line." He reached for a small envelope resting beside the device. "Lestrade was good enough to provide the contents found on Larch's person," he explained. From it, he drew a folded piece of parchment and a narrow slip of stiff card. On the parchment was a list of coded figures, dates, weights, and destinations, while the card bore a crimson wax seal imprinted with a curious emblem, a compass rose encircling a single pointed needle. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "We have seen this before, Watson." I blinked in surprise. "Have we?" He rose, went to his cabinet of indexed clippings and pulled from it a yellowed newspaper cutting. "From 2 years past," he said, handing it to me. "A report from the Prague Gazette concerning the theft of experimental instruments from the Imperial Academy, one of which, as it happens, was described as a precision apparatus for fluidic delivery, sealed with the mark of the Needles Guild. The same emblem, you see. The device in question was never recovered. The name stirred faint memory. The Needles Guild? I confess I recall nothing of it. Few do, Holmes replied, his voice low. An esoteric order of craftspeople and engineers, operating discreetly between London and the continent. Their members are known only by their insignia and their work, delicate mechanisms, often of dubious legality. It appears, Watson, that Mr. Ashcroft's dealings extended far beyond mere ledgers. He crossed to the window, where dawn was beginning to bleed pale light through the fog. "Tell me, what impression did you form of Larch during his arrest?" "He seemed frightened," I said. "Desperate, even. I doubt he was the mastermind." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A man of obedience, not of intellect. The question, therefore, is, who employed him? And for what purpose was this machine to be delivered to Dock 11 under such secrecy?" He turned back abruptly, his eyes alight with energy. "Watson, we must pay Larch a visit before the Yard begins their clumsy interrogation. There is much that can be learned from a frightened man before he has been frightened too much." By 8 o'clock, we were at Scotland Yard. Lestrade, weary but in good spirits, met us in the corridor outside the holding cells. "You're in luck, Mr. Holmes. Your man hasn't said a word all night, keeps asking for someone named Calder." Holmes's brow lifted slightly. "Calder, you say? Interesting. I believe that name appears here." He produced the parchment from his pocket, running a long finger down the column of codes. "Yes, entry number 12, shipment via sea, verification required." Most curious indeed. We entered the small cell where Henry Larch sat hunched on a bench, his hands clasped tightly together. His eyes darted toward us, then down again, as though expecting a blow. Holmes approached him not as an interrogator, but as a physician might approach a feverish patient. Calm, deliberate, without menace. "Mr. Larch," he said gently, "you have placed yourself in a most unenviable position. Scotland Yard believes you to be part of a criminal conspiracy involving theft, smuggling, and perhaps murder. But I am less certain. You do not strike me as a man of invention or ambition. Rather, I see before me a subordinate, a craftsman who obeyed orders he scarcely understood." The man raised his head, confusion flickering in his eyes. I didn't know what it was for, sir. I only followed instructions. Mr. Calder said it was an experimental piece meant for demonstration." Holmes inclined his head. "And this Calder, where might one find him?" Larch swallowed hard. "He works out of an old workshop near St. George's Wharf. Said he used to be an engineer before the war, but he paid well and I needed the money. That's all I know. Describe him. Tall, thin, foreign accent, maybe German or Czech, always wore gloves even indoors. He had a scar on his right temple like a burn mark." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Larch. I suggest you continue to be so when Lestrade returns. You may yet extricate yourself from this web if you remain cooperative." Outside the cell, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Have this man kept under guard, but treat him carefully. His fear is genuine, and it may yet serve us." Lestrade frowned. "And what do you make of this Calder fellow?" "I make of him," Holmes said evenly, "a man who designs death and hides behind science. If my deduction holds true, he is not merely an engineer, but one of the last known artificers of the Needles Guild." An hour later we arrived at St. George's Wharf. The district lay shrouded in the pale morning mist, the air heavy with the scent of tar and salt. The workshop Holmes sought stood at the far end of a narrow lane, its windows shuttered and door secured with a new padlock. Holmes crouched, examined the ground, and pointed to a faint indentation in the dust. "Two sets of footprints," he observed, "one leading in, none leading out. Someone is still within." With a deft twist of his lockpick, the door yielded. The interior was dim, cluttered with tools and unfinished machinery. The scent of oil hung thick in the air. On a central table lay a spread of blueprints, complex sketches of gears, needles, and clockwork components, each marked with the same crimson emblem. Holmes's eyes darted from paper to paper, his expression grave. "So it is as I feared. Calder is manufacturing more than one device. This is a workshop of death, Watson. Each drawing represents an instrument more subtle and silent than the last." He paused suddenly, his gaze fixed on a small scrap of paper pinned beneath a gear. Upon it was scrawled a single line in elegant script: "The needle must point east before it pierces the heart." Holmes's face darkened. "It appears, Watson, that we are dealing not with a mere assassin, but with a philosopher of murder. And if I am not mistaken, his next move will occur before the day is done." Holmes stood motionless for several moments, his sharp eyes fixed upon the enigmatic phrase. The faint morning light that filtered through the workshop's grimy windows seemed to emphasize the tension that hung between us. He read the words again in a low voice, as though testing their rhythm for hidden meaning. The needle must point east before it pierces the heart. A riddle wrapped in precision. Watson, like everything this Calder fellow designs. He moved to the map pinned upon the far wall, its corners weighted down by bits of metal. The map depicted London in meticulous detail, but it was marked by strange notations, red dots and arrows, intersecting lines radiating from a single point near the river's bend. Holmes studied it intently. East, Watson. If this refers to direction rather than metaphor, then perhaps the act, the piercing of the heart, must occur when the mechanism is oriented thus. A machine of death that functions by alignment? Ingenious if diabolical. As he traced one of the red lines, I noticed it ended near a name scrawled in ink. Ashcroft Bank, East Dock Branch. My heart quickened. Holmes, I said, that is the same Ashcroft who... Precisely, Watson. The late financier whose death began this entire affair. Holmes's voice carried a restrained excitement. And now we see the connection forming. A mechanical assassin, a coded message, and a financier who likely paid for the wrong secret. The needle's path may not refer merely to the machine, but to its intended trajectory, both literal and figurative. He swept the blueprints and map into his case with swift precision. Come, we must move quickly. Lestrade must be warned to guard the East Dock offices. If Calder intends another demonstration of his infernal craft, it will be there. We hailed a cab from the wharf, and as the vehicle rattled over the cobbles toward the docks, Holmes remained deep in thought, his gaze fixed upon the shifting London skyline. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the cold geometry of warehouses and cranes along the river. Watson, he said abruptly, consider the message's wording again. If the needle must point east before piercing the heart, then there is a sequence. First the alignment, then the strike. Suppose Calder intends to test his mechanism upon a human target, once the sun rises in the east. The time would correspond with morning business hours. You mean to say he plans to kill again publicly? Not publicly, perhaps, but symbolically. If Ashcroft's death was the first demonstration, then the second will confirm the perfection of his device. A man obsessed with precision might well choose to synchronize murder with the turning of the compass. We reached the East Dock district just as the bells of St. Mary's struck 9. The area was already stirring with the day's activity. Porters unloading cargo, clerks hurrying with ledgers tucked beneath their arms, and the river glinting faintly beneath the pale sun. Lestrade met us outside the bank, his expression grave. We've got men posted on all sides, Holmes, he said. No one in or out without my word. Do you expect trouble? Holmes's eyes scanned the building's facade. Every window, every vent. Trouble, Inspector, has already arrived. We are simply late to its unveiling. We entered the bank together, our footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Inside, the clerks worked nervously under Lestrade's watchful officers. The manager, a nervous fellow named Keating, hurried forward. Mr. Holmes, I assure you, nothing unusual has occurred this morning. Though, he hesitated, there was a delivery, a crate marked Fragile Instruments, sent from one of our subsidiary offices near St. George's Wharf. Holmes's head snapped toward him. A crate, you say? Where is it now? In the records room, just through there, Keating said, gesturing toward a narrow corridor. Holmes strode ahead and I followed closely. The small room smelled faintly of polish and ink, filled with shelves of ledgers stacked like soldiers in formation. In the center stood the crate, plain wood sealed with wax, and stamped with the familiar crimson emblem of the compass and needle. Holmes approached it warily, his magnifying lens glinting as he inspected the seal. Unbroken, he murmured. The mechanism may yet be dormant. Watson, stand clear. He took a thin blade from his pocket and carefully pried open the lid. For a moment there was only silence, then a faint click sounded, a heartbeat of danger. Holmes froze, his eyes flashing. Down! He shouted. I barely had time to throw myself aside before a sharp metallic whine filled the air. From within the crate, a slender steel arm shot upward, its needle gleaming like a serpent's fang. It struck empty air, then locked in place, quivering. A thin wisp of vapor rose from its tip, harmless now, but deadly had anyone stood nearer. Holmes approached it once more, now with calculated calm. Ingenious, he whispered. The device activates by tampering with the lid. A mechanism so finely tuned that even the pressure of opening it triggers the strike. Calder meant this for a courier, perhaps the manager himself. Once again we were a mere breath from death. Lestrade swore under his breath. Good Lord. So that's what your Needles path is about, eh? A mechanical killer hidden in a box? Holmes gave a faint smile. No, Inspector. That is but the tool. The path itself is the network of delivery. The movement of these infernal machines from one hand to another. Somewhere within that path, the true architect remains hidden, orchestrating it all. As he examined the now inert device, Holmes's expression grew distant. The eastward reference may also denote direction of transport. Goods leaving the docks, moving toward the continent. If so, we have not stopped Calder's plan, merely delayed it. At that very moment, a constable burst into the room, breathless. Inspector! A man matching the suspect's description was seen boarding a steamer at Tilbury Pier not 20 minutes ago. Headed east. Holmes's eyes lit with grim satisfaction. There it is, Watson, the needle points east. Calder flees toward his next operation, and we must follow swiftly, or London shall not be the last city to tremble at his invention. Within the hour, arrangements were made. Lestrade organized his men while Holmes and I boarded a police launch bound for Tilbury. The cold wind whipped across the Thames, and Holmes stood at the prow, his coat flaring behind him like a dark banner. Watson, he said quietly, the hand that built this device is not that of a mere craftsman. Calder is guided by something larger, a patron who financed this research, perhaps one who lost much through Ashcroft's dealings. We are approaching the heart of a conspiracy, far greater than it first appeared. He turned, his profile etched against the grey morning light. The Needle's path began with a banker's death, but I fear it will end in a revelation that pierces the very heart of London itself. The launch surged forward, the fog parting before us like a veil, and I could not shake the feeling that every turn of the river was drawing us closer to a truth as sharp and deadly as the Needle itself. The police launch cut swiftly through the grey waters of the Thames, its engine churning a low, steady hum that seemed to echo Holmes's own concentration. The cold wind bit at our faces, but he remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the morning mist began to lift over Tilbury's industrial sprawl. I could tell his mind was racing, an intricate network of deductions spinning behind that calm exterior. Watson, he said suddenly without turning, observe how neatly this man Calder has arranged his escape. A steamer to the east, carrying him toward the continent, where extradition becomes complicated and pursuit nearly hopeless. And yet he flees too soon. Too soon? I repeated. Indeed. A true mastermind would have waited to confirm that his contraption had succeeded at the bank. His premature departure tells me he is not acting alone. There remains someone in London, his superior, his correspondent, or perhaps the financier behind the design. The wind caught his words and flung them away, but their weight remained with me. The idea of a hidden hand directing events from the shadows filled me with unease. Holmes's gaze did not waver as the docks of Tilbury came into view, long lines of cranes and warehouses rising from the fog like skeletal giants. We disembarked and made our way through the bustle of the pier. Dock workers shouted, ropes creaked, and the acrid scent of coal hung thick in the air. Lestrade, who had followed in the second launch, joined us breathlessly. The steamer's name is Elysium, he reported. Bound for Hamburg, scheduled to depart within the hour. We've cordoned off the quay, but there are dozens of passengers already aboard. Holmes gave a curt nod. Excellent. Then we must find Calder before the ship weighs anchor. Watson, keep close. This man is cunning, and desperation sharpens his wits. We moved swiftly along the wharf, passing stacks of cargo crates and barrels marked with foreign stamps. Holmes's gaze flicked from face to face with unerring precision, his mind filtering possibilities faster than any man could speak them aloud. Suddenly he halted near a group of passengers waiting to board. There, he whispered, the gloves. See how he wears them despite the warmth of the hour, and that faint burn mark on the temple. Indeed, the tall, gaunt figure standing apart from the crowd matched Larcher's description precisely. His demeanor was composed but wary, his eyes darting toward the river at every sound. Holmes's hand brushed the inside of his coat, ready to draw his revolver if necessary. Lestrade motioned quietly to two constables, who began circling behind the suspect. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Calder," he called evenly, his voice slicing through the noise. "You will find that flight is an exercise in futility. Scotland Yard is most thorough when it wishes to be." The man turned sharply. His expression did not show fear, only the cold calculation of someone caught between surrender and strategy. "I think you mistake me, sir," he said, his accent thick but controlled. "My name is Carl Adler, a merchant of instruments." Holmes smiled faintly. "A convenient trade for a man who crafts mechanical assassins. Your handiwork nearly claimed another victim this morning. You will come with us." Calder's eyes flicked once toward the ship, then to the crate-laden pier. In that instant, I saw his hand move, a sudden, fluid motion toward his coat pocket. Holmes lunged forward and a shot rang out. The bullet struck harmlessly into a crate behind us, splintering wood. Before the man could fire again, Lestrade's men seized him, wrenching the revolver from his grasp. Holmes examined the weapon, a small derringer of foreign make, before tucking it into his pocket. "I see, Watson," he said calmly, "a craftsman to the end. Even his pistol bears the same precision as his machines." Calder was taken to a nearby customs office, where Holmes began his quiet interrogation. The man sat stiffly, his pale eyes fixed upon Holmes with a kind of weary contempt. "I have nothing to say," he began. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Then allow me to speak for you. You were once an engineer of the Imperial Academy in Prague, dismissed for unethical experimentation. You found employment with a syndicate here in London, one financed by a certain banker named Ashcroft, whose untimely death freed your operations from financial oversight. Since then, you have manufactured devices capable of delivering poison through clockwork precision. You call this design the needle's path, do you not?" Calder's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Holmes continued, his tone as sharp as the needle itself. "You intended to sell your invention to foreign interests, to those who see assassination as a means of diplomacy. But when Ashcroft threatened to expose your dealings, you silenced him with his own creation. The irony no doubt pleased your sense of symmetry." A flicker crossed Calder's face, whether of surprise or anger I could not tell. Holmes saw it too. "So I strike close to the truth," he said softly. "But you are not the architect, are you? There is another, the symbol of the compass and needle, whose hand first drew it." For a moment Calder's composure cracked. "You know nothing," he hissed. "The guild is beyond you. You cannot cut the thread once it has begun." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then it still exists, the Needles Guild. Tell me, does your compass point east because your master resides there?" Calder's silence was answer enough. He slumped back, his expression once more unreadable. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," he said quietly. "There are others, more skilled than I, more devoted. The path leads where it must." Holmes rose slowly. "Then we shall follow it to its end." Outside the office, Lestrade looked puzzled. "He's raving, Holmes. You don't really mean to chase ghosts across Europe?" "Ghosts, perhaps," Holmes replied. "But ghosts leave footprints when they walk in fog." He turned to me. "Watson, prepare yourself. We shall not rest yet. Calder's capture gives us only the tail of the serpent. The head remains in London, or so I suspect. We took the return launch at dusk, the river now cloaked in a sullen twilight. Holmes remained at the prow once again, silent, his eyes on the dark waters slipping past. I could tell he was reconstructing every fragment of the case, the coded parchment, the crimson thread, the clockwork device, the cryptic message. At last he spoke almost to himself. "The needle must point east before it pierces the heart." Calder fled eastward, yet his words speak of inevitability, of completion. The path may not refer to geography at all, but to the course of a plan nearing its final stroke. "The heart, Watson. Perhaps not a man's, but the heart of the city itself. London?" I asked. He nodded grimly. "Yes, the experiment was but a test. The true design, whatever form it takes, is meant to strike here where its creator can witness the result. We have little time. When next we act, we must uncover not only who commands the Needles Guild, but what purpose drives it." The current carried us onward toward the heart of the sleeping city, the lamps of London flickering to life one by one along the banks. And as we neared the familiar curve of Baker Street, I saw in Holmes's eyes a light unlike any I had seen before, not the thrill of pursuit, but the quiet, deadly focus of a man who knows the final move of a game has already begun. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the city had settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the clatter of carriages replaced by the distant echo of bootsteps and the melancholy whistle of the night patrol. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. for Holmes's coat was still damp from the river mist and streaked with soot from the steamer's engine. He brushed past her polite inquiries with a distracted wave, moving straight to the hearth where the remnants of the morning's experiment still cluttered the table. Without removing his gloves, Holmes struck a match and relit the lamp, bathing the room in its warm glow. "Watson," he said briskly, "the compass mark we found upon the parchment, let us revisit its pattern." He reached into his pocket, producing the now familiar fragment, its faded ink still bearing the faint outline of a needle, overlaid upon concentric circles. "This is no mere emblem. Look, observe the radii. Each line measures precisely 2¼ inches apart. It forms not a symbol but a design, a map perhaps disguised as geometry." He spread the parchment flat beside a large map of London, his fingers tracing several key streets. "The compass points east, yes, but relative to what? If we align it with magnetic north and overlay the pattern here." He adjusted the parchment slightly, and to my astonishment, several of the circular markings fell perfectly upon the city's major landmarks: St. Paul's, the Bank of England, and at the very heart, the Tower. "You believe this represents the city itself?" I asked, leaning closer. "Precisely. Calder's so-called Needle's Path may not describe a route at all, but a sequence of points, each significant in some hidden design. If my calculations are correct, the Tower of London marks the culmination. It is there that the Needle's Path ends, or begins." A faint smile crossed his lips, the kind that signaled he was already 10 steps ahead. He crossed to the chemistry table and poured himself a measure of strong tea, though I suspected he barely tasted it. "Lestrade's men will have Calder locked away under heavy guard," he said absently, "but men of his kind rarely act alone. Someone will attempt to silence him before dawn." I frowned. "Surely the Yard has taken precautions." "Undoubtedly." "And yet," he replied, "if the Guild truly operates as Calder implied, then we are not dealing with common conspirators. These are craftsmen, mathematicians, clockmakers, surgeons, bound by a single principle: precision through secrecy. To them, the taking of life is a calculation, not a crime." His words chilled me more than the night air had. He moved again toward the map, deep in thought. "The question, Watson, is not how they kill, but why. The devices we've seen are too intricate, too deliberate for mere assassination. They are messages written in machinery." Before I could reply, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson, alarmed by the lateness of the hour, peeked into the sitting room before admitting Inspector Lestrade, his face pale and drawn. "Holmes," he began, "you were right. There's been an attempt. 2 guards at the Yard found dead. No gunshot, no wound, just puncture marks as though from a fine needle." Holmes straightened at once. "And Calder?" "Gone," Lestrade said grimly. His cell was opened from the outside. The lock picked clean as clockwork. Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden intensity. "Then the Needles Guild has reclaimed its own. They move faster than I anticipated." He turned to me. "Watson, your revolver, if you please." We go to the Tower. Within the hour we were rattling through the fog-bound streets, our cab wheels splashing through puddles as the gaslights blurred into streaks of gold and grey. Holmes sat forward, his gaze fixed ahead, speaking in quick, clipped bursts. "Calder's escape is no accident. They removed him not to free him, but to finish his task. The final stage of the path is set for tonight, at the Tower, where both secrecy and spectacle may coincide." The cab drew to a halt before the fortress gates, where the sentries, already on alert, allowed us passage after a brief exchange. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the smell of old stone. Shadows pooled along the corridors, and our footsteps echoed eerily against the vaulted ceilings. Holmes moved swiftly, consulting both map and compass as we advanced. "Here," he said, stopping near the White Tower's eastern wall. "According to Calder's design, this is the convergence point." We descended a narrow staircase leading into the armory vaults, rows of ancient weapons gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Then Holmes froze, raising a hand for silence. A faint, rhythmic ticking echoed through the chamber. He moved toward a stack of crates, crouching low. "Clockwork," he whispered. "And not a small device." My pulse quickened as he lifted a wooden panel to reveal a contraption unlike anything I had ever seen. A brass cylinder wound with coils of fine tubing, a glass vial at its center filled with a dark, glimmering liquid. The ticking grew louder as the gears turned within. Holmes examined it only briefly, before pulling his toolkit from his pocket. "A mechanical dispersal unit," he murmured. "If triggered, it would release vaporized toxin throughout the chamber. Perhaps the entire fortress." "Ingenious." "And monstrous. Can you stop it?" I asked. He did not look up. "I must. There is no alternative." His hands worked quickly, unscrewing a panel and cutting a series of fine wires. Each motion must counter the last. Too soon and the mechanism will accelerate. Too late and... The ticking faltered, then ceased altogether. Holmes exhaled, the tension melting from his shoulders. "There, neutralized. The guild's plan ends here for now." But even as he spoke, another sound reached us, a door creaking open at the far end of the vault. From the darkness emerged two figures clad in dark coats and gloves, their faces concealed by masks of polished steel shaped like elongated needles. Holmes rose slowly, his revolver drawn. "The guild, I presume," one of them spoke, voice muffled by the mask. "You interfere with precision, Mr. Holmes. The path was not yours to alter." "On the contrary," Holmes replied coolly. "It was my duty to correct it." A moment later, chaos erupted, the flash of gunfire, the shattering of glass, the smell of gunpowder mingling with the acrid sting of chemicals. I fired once, striking a lantern that plunged the vault into semi-darkness. When the smoke cleared, one figure lay motionless while the other fled into the stairwell, disappearing into the shadows. Holmes did not pursue. He knelt beside the fallen assailant, removing the mask. The face beneath was pale and unremarkable, save for the faint tattoo of a compass inked behind the ear. He examined it silently for a long moment. "Every craftsman leaves a signature," he said finally, "but this one is not the master's hand. We are still chasing his reflection." Lestrade and his men arrived minutes later to secure the vault. Holmes gave a brief report, his voice calm but distant, his eyes still fixed upon the dead man's tattoo. As we rode home through the fading mist of dawn, Holmes leaned back, exhaustion etched faintly into his features. Yet his mind, I knew, was far from rest. "The guild will not stop, Watson," he said quietly. "Calder's path was only a single thread in a greater tapestry. Somewhere in London the needle still turns, and when it points again, we must be ready." The first light of morning broke over the Thames as we turned toward Baker Street once more, and I saw in Holmes's expression not triumph, but the grim certainty of a man who has glimpsed the edge of a deeper design yet to unfold. The dawn's pale light filtered through the curtains of Baker Street, casting thin, wavering shadows upon the carpet. I sat opposite Holmes, who had not moved from his chair since our return. The remnants of the night's ordeal lay scattered across the table, scraps of parchment, fragments of wire, and a half-empty teacup grown cold. He stared into the fireplace as though the dying embers contained some secret geometry only he could perceive. I ventured to speak softly. "You've not closed your eyes in 2 days, Holmes. Surely the matter is concluded. The device disarmed, the culprits caught or fled." His lips curved faintly, though without amusement. "Concluded, Watson?" "No. We have silenced an instrument, not the hand that built it." He tapped his finger against the armrest, his eyes distant. "The guild's device was not meant merely to kill. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept. Their true purpose remains obscured." He rose abruptly, pacing before the fire. "Consider their precision. High toxin distributed through a mechanical dispersal unit, delivered with mathematical efficiency. It is not chaos they seek, but control. Whoever commands such minds commands the very rhythm of the city." Before I could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression strained. "A message, Mr. Holmes. It came by express rider marked urgent." Holmes took the envelope, broke the seal, and scanned its contents. His expression did not change, yet I saw the faint tightening around his eyes that I had learned to recognize as the signal of grave import. "From Inspector Lestrade," he said. "They've found Calder, alive." "Barely, near the docks at Limehouse. His captors, or rescuers depending on one's perspective, abandoned him after some violent struggle. He was discovered with a wound to the chest and in his hand this." Holmes unfolded the note enclosed with Lestrade's message, a small slip of paper scrawled with a single phrase, "The needle turns toward the heart." "What does it mean?" I asked. Holmes moved to his desk, pulling a large map of London once more into view. "The guild's design follows precision. If we take the tower as the terminus of the first path, then the next must begin from it, radiating outward. toward the city's heart. He placed the compass upon the map, its needle quivering faintly toward the west. The heart of London, Watson. Not the river nor the docks, but the very seat of its pulse. He drew a circle around the location, Westminster. Within the hour, we were again on the move. A thick fog rolling through the streets as our cab clattered over the cobblestones. The Houses of Parliament loomed ghost-like through the haze, their Gothic spires piercing the pale morning sky. Lestrade met us by the riverside gates, his expression grim. "We've doubled the guard since your warning, Holmes. But if you're right, what are we even looking for?" "A pattern," Holmes replied, scanning the building's facade with his field glass. "Something so precise it would appear invisible to the untrained eye." We entered through a side passage, our steps echoing faintly along the marble floors. Workmen and clerks bustled about in quiet urgency, oblivious to the shadow hanging over them. Holmes examined every detail, the angle of the gas fixtures, the alignment of the railings, even the brass inlays upon the floor. Then near the central rotunda he stopped. "There," he murmured, kneeling beside the base of a great column. A small metallic object was wedged between the stones, no larger than a coin, but engraved with the same concentric pattern we had seen upon the parchment. Holmes pried it loose with his penknife. The faint ticking began at once. Lestrade swore softly. "Another of their devices?" "Not identical," Holmes said. "This one's smaller, localized. This signal transmitter, not a weapon. It serves to synchronize others at a distance." He rose swiftly. "We are standing within a network, gentlemen. The Guild has seeded London with precision mechanisms, each linked to a central pulse. We followed him down a narrow corridor to the substructure beneath the building. The air grew damp and cold, thick with the scent of stone and metal. In the flickering lamplight, rows of strange apparatus gleamed, clockwork cylinders connected by fine copper threads, all converging upon a single large mechanism affixed to the wall. Its face was etched with a compass rose, its needle trembling in rhythm with an unseen heartbeat. Holmes studied it silently, then turned to me. "Watson, note the oscillation, steady, deliberate. They mean to synchronize not merely clocks, but people. Imagine an entire city regulated by unseen precision, its commerce, its power, its life, governed by mechanical command." Before I could answer, a shadow stirred from the far side of the chamber. A tall figure stepped forward, his coat immaculate, his gloves gleaming. He regarded Holmes with calm, almost scholarly interest. "Mr. Holmes," the stranger said, his voice smooth and resonant, "you have walked the path to its end." Holmes's revolver was in his hand before the words had faded. "And you," he said quietly, "must be its architect." The man inclined his head slightly. "We are craftsmen, sir. Our work is precision itself. London is chaos incarnate. Our guild merely seeks to perfect its rhythm. By murder and manipulation." Holmes snapped. "By order," the man replied coolly. Calder was weak. He failed to understand the magnitude of our purpose. You, however, might. There was a strange intensity in his gaze as he stepped closer. "You, Holmes, possess the mind of a craftsman. Join us, and together we could design a world governed by reason, where men act not from folly or passion, but by measurable law." For a moment, the chamber fell utterly silent. I could see the conflict flicker across Holmes's features, not temptation, but recognition. Then he shook his head. "Reason without conscience is the most dangerous mechanism of all. I have seen what your precision breeds." The man sighed almost sadly. "Then your role ends here." He turned toward the great mechanism and pressed a small lever. The compass needle began to spin rapidly, the hum of machinery rising to a sharp, rhythmic whine. Holmes lunged forward, striking the man's hand aside, and the two struggled amid the machinery. Sparks erupted as wires tore loose, the air filling with the scent of ozone and burning oil. "Watson, cut the main conduit," Holmes shouted. I obeyed, seizing a heavy wrench from the floor and striking the copper pipe that connected the central device. Steam hissed violently, and with a deafening crack the compass face shattered. The humming ceased. The lights flickered once and went out, plunging us into darkness. When the smoke cleared, the man was gone, vanished into the tunnels beyond. Only the ruined mechanism remained, its delicate components shattered beyond repair. Holmes stood silent for a long moment, his face ghostly in the dim glow of our lantern. "He escaped," I said quietly. "Yes," Holmes murmured, "but not unmarked. The guild has lost its rhythm this night. Their precision is broken. Lestrade's men swarmed in soon after, securing the site and hauling away the remains of the machinery. Holmes gave only the briefest of explanations before turning toward the river. As we emerged into the cold dawn air, the chimes of Big Ben echoed across the city, steady, resolute, unbroken. Holmes paused, looking up toward the sound. "The heart still beats," he said softly, "and so long as it does, the needle will turn again. But now at least London may sleep." We walked on in silence, the fog curling once more around the lamplight, and I felt, as I often did after our most perilous adventures, the faint and humbling realization that beneath all his brilliance, Holmes carried not pride, but burden, a man forever calculating the balance between order and chaos in the clockwork of the world. The following morning brought little respite. The heavy fog that had cloaked the city the previous night lingered still, hanging low and thick over Baker Street, muffling the sounds of carriages and footsteps. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated precisely as I had left him, leaning forward in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed unblinking upon the charred scrap of metal salvaged from the guild's mechanism. "Watson," he said without turning as I entered, "observe this fragment. What do you make of it?" I examined the piece under the lamplight. It was a sliver of brass, its surface etched with lines so fine they seemed almost invisible, like the grooves of a phonograph cylinder. "It appears mechanical," I said cautiously, "though the pattern seems deliberate." Holmes nodded once, his voice low and reflective. "Deliberate indeed. Not a mere part of the dispersal device, but an inscription, a message encoded not in words, but in vibration." He turned it in the light, his tone gaining sharpness. "Each groove corresponds to an interval of sound. When played upon a mechanical reader, this would produce a sequence of tones, music, Watson, or something very like it." "Music?" I exclaimed. "Surely you do not suggest, not melody perhaps, but measure?" "The guild works in rhythm, as I have said. They use precision not only in motion but in sound. This fragment, I suspect, is a record of synchronization, a key by which their devices communicate." He rose abruptly, pacing before the window. "The architect we confronted last night, the man with the compass sigil, spoke of order, of a world governed by measurable law. To control machinery through sound is but the first step. To control men by rhythm, the second." I stared at him, uncertain whether fatigue had driven his imagination too far. But then he gestured toward the street below. "Listen," he said. Through the fog came the faint chiming of a clock tower striking the half-hour. Holmes closed his eyes. The guild's design sought to align the city itself, to create harmony through control. If one could synchronize a city's clocks, one could synchronize its people, its markets, its trains, its very thoughts. To such minds this is not tyranny, it is perfection. His expression darkened. "We have destroyed one machine, yes, but the principle remains. And the man who conceived it still walks free." Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Urgent, rapid. Mrs. Hudson entered with an envelope bearing the seal of Scotland Yard. Holmes slit it open with his penknife and scanned the brief message. "From Lestrade," he said. "A body has been recovered near Millbank Prison. Drowned, yet curiously unmarked. Found in his pocket was a second brass fragment." Without another word, he reached for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson." The game, though diminished, continues. The streets near Millbank lay steeped in mist, the Thames a pale, ghostly ribbon in the distance. Lestrade awaited us beneath a lamp-post, his face drawn and weary. "Same mark behind the ear," he said grimly as we approached. "Compass tattoo, same as the one in the tower vault. But there's more. His pockets were filled with these." He held out a small pouch. Inside were half a dozen identical fragments of brass, each etched with impossibly fine grooves. Holmes examined them one by one, his expression unreadable. "This is no accident," he murmured. "He was not killed by the guild, he was discarded by them. These fragments were meant to be found." "A warning or an invitation?" "An invitation!" I echoed. "Yes, observe their placement. Each recovered fragment lies along the river's course, from the tower eastward to Millbank, now perhaps beyond. The river forms a line, Watson, and the line forms the next path." "Another needle," I said quietly. "Precisely." He turned to Lestrade. "Have the remaining embankments searched, every wharf, every pier. If my suspicion holds, The fragments form a message visible only when arranged in sequence. Lestrade frowned but gave a curt nod and departed with his men. Holmes and I remained by the water's edge, the mist curling around us. He seemed restless, impatient, his gaze darting ceaselessly from the river to the sky. "Holmes," I said at last, "you've been on edge since last night. What troubles you more, the guild's persistence or the man behind it?" He gave a short laugh, devoid of humor. "Both. The guild's strength lies not merely in intellect but in anonymity. Each member is both tool and mechanism, driven by a hand they never see. It is that unseen engineer I seek, the true architect of the Needle's path. We followed the river northward, and by dusk, word came that another fragment had been found, this one at Westminster Bridge, wedged between the stones. Holmes examined it beneath his magnifying lens and froze. "Watson," he said quietly, "this one bears an additional mark, a series of dots and dashes engraved beneath the grooves. Morse code. What does it say?" He read it aloud slowly. "When the city sleeps, the heart shall stop." A chill passed through me. Another thread? Holmes did not answer. He turned toward the distant skyline, where the outline of Big Ben loomed faintly through the fog. "Not a threat, Watson. A promise." He quickened his pace, calling for a cab. "They mean to strike again, tonight. The guild's true machine lies still hidden, and if the message is literal, their target is not merely symbolic. The heart of the city, the clock itself." We arrived at Westminster shortly before midnight. The great tower loomed over us, its face dimmed by mist. A handful of constables guarded the entrance, already alerted by Lestrade's men. Holmes wasted no time, leading us up the narrow spiral staircase to the clock chamber. There, amidst the massive gears and pendulums, we found it, a second device far larger and more intricate than the first. Brass coils interlaced with copper tubing, each segment connected by fine wire to the tower's inner mechanisms. The rhythmic ticking of the clock merged eerily with the hum of the machine. Holmes moved at once to inspect it, his hands steady despite the danger. "It draws upon the clock's own power," he muttered. "They've transformed the heartbeat of London into their instrument." A faint clinking echoed from the stairwell below, footsteps ascending. Holmes motioned for silence, drawing his revolver. A figure appeared in the doorway, the same masked man we had seen at the tower. He spoke softly. "If the needle turns, Mr. Holmes, the city will awaken to a perfect silence." Holmes fired, but the figure had already darted aside, vanishing into the shadows of the mechanism. Sparks flew as bullets struck metal. I rushed forward, but Holmes raised a hand. "No pursuit. We've not time for vengeance." He bent over the mechanism, wrench in hand, cutting at the power conduits. The machine shuddered, the humming deepened. "Watson, on my mark, disconnect the pendulum regulator," he shouted. I obeyed, pulling the lever with all my strength. The great pendulum ground to a halt. The ticking ceased, and with it the machine collapsed inward, its gears locking in perfect symmetry before bursting apart in a plume of steam. For several seconds there was only silence. Then from somewhere deep below, the bells of Westminster began to chime, 12 clear, resonant notes that echoed across the river. The city had survived the stroke of midnight. Holmes leaned heavily against the wall, his breath uneven but his eyes bright. "The guild's rhythm is broken once more," he murmured. "Yet the man remains, the unseen conductor behind the orchestra." We descended into the night, the fog parting around us, as though the city itself exhaled. Holmes paused upon the bridge, looking out over the water. "Watson," he said softly, "remember this night. We have halted a machine, not an idea, and ideas, like rivers, flow ever onward." His gaze lingered on the distant skyline, where the faintest blush of dawn touched the clouds. And though victory was ours, I could not help but feel that the true needle had only just begun to turn. The night deepened around Baker Street, wrapping the city in a cold shroud of fog that seemed almost sentient, curling between the cobblestones and whispering against the gas lamps. Inside, the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock was the only sound that dared intrude upon the silence. Holmes stood at the window, the faint glow of his pipe illuminating the sharp angles of his face, his eyes fixed on nothing, or perhaps on everything. I watched him with growing unease, for the longer he remained silent, the more certain I became that the case had taken a turn, even he found troubling. Without turning, he spoke softly. "Watson, You recall the peculiar remark made by Miss Ashcroft when she mentioned her father's correspondence with Dr. Kellaway. Indeed. She said her father destroyed one of the letters the day before his disappearance, I replied. Holmes nodded slowly. Precisely. The destruction of evidence before vanishing. It suggests not panic, but intent. Sir Edmund Ashcroft was concealing something far more dangerous than we initially imagined. He moved away from the window and began pacing. Each fragment we have gathered points toward a calculated design. The coded message, the missing vial from Kellaway's laboratory, the murdered bookbinder in Limehouse, all threads of one tapestry. And yet the central figure remains obscured. Someone stands behind these actions, manipulating events with chilling precision. I poured a measure of brandy and handed him a glass. Do you suspect Kellaway himself? Holmes took it absently, staring into the liquid as though it contained the answer. Not Kellaway. He is a pawn, albeit one of scientific brilliance. But the hand that guides him, that hand is neither academic nor naive. It is a mind that understands fear as a tool, silence as a weapon. He sank into his armchair, his long fingers steepled before him. The pattern, Watson, lies in the symbol we overlooked, the needle. The needle? Not as an instrument of medicine, but as an emblem. The needle's path. The name whispered among those who deal in forbidden alchemy and psychological manipulation. I've heard faint rumors before. In the darker corners of the continent, an order of intellectuals and aristocrats who believe the mind can be re-threaded as one might mend torn silk. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. You mean they tamper with human thought? Exactly, Holmes said gravely. And Ashcroft, a man once devoted to the study of ancient symbology, might have uncovered something they wished kept buried. Before I could respond, a sharp knock broke the tension. Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice followed, announcing an unexpected visitor. Holmes motioned for her to send the person in. A tall, gaunt man entered, his coat soaked from the fog, his eyes flicking nervously toward every shadow. Holmes gestured for him to sit, but the man remained standing. My name is Victor Latham," he stammered. "I was assistant to Dr. Kellaway. You must listen. There isn't much time." Holmes leaned forward, calm but alert. "Go on, Mr. Latham." "They'll come for me soon," he whispered. "Kellaway's not himself anymore. He spoke of voices guiding his work, of a design etched into his dreams. He said Ashcroft's discovery unlocked a pathway that leads beyond thought. When I tried to question him, he said I was too weak to understand. 2 nights ago, I followed him to an abandoned apothecary in Bishopsgate. There were others waiting there. They called themselves the Keepers of the Needle." Holmes's eyes glimmered. "Describe them." "Masked," Latham said. "Each wore a symbol stitched in silver thread, the shape of a needle coiled into a spiral. They spoke in fragments of Latin and another language I didn't recognize. I fled when one of them noticed me. Since then, I've been watched." Holmes stood and crossed the room, retrieving his coat and revolver. "Watson, we must move swiftly. Mr. Latham, you will accompany us. If your account is true, we may find the missing piece tonight." Within minutes, we were in a cab, rattling through the mist-drenched streets toward Bishopsgate. The city slept, but its underbelly stirred, a realm of secrets, of whispering alleys and unlit corners. The apothecary, when we arrived, appeared lifeless, its sign half-torn, windows veiled with grime. Holmes's lantern beam sliced through the dark as he pushed open the warped door. Inside, the air was thick with decay and chemical residue. Glass bottles lay shattered on the floor. Then, as we reached the rear chamber, the beam fell upon a symbol scorched into the wall, the spiral needle. Beneath it, a phrase in Latin, "Per aquam mentis iter est," "Through the needle lies the path of the mind." Holmes's voice was low, controlled. "They were here recently." Suddenly, a faint scraping echoed from behind a shelving unit. Holmes signaled for silence, drew his revolver and approached. With a sharp pull, he moved the shelf aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Watson," he murmured, "we have crossed from reason into the shadow of obsession. Stay close." We descended slowly, each step creaking underfoot. The passage opened into a chamber dimly lit by oil lamps. Papers, glass tubes, and strange mechanical devices covered a table at its center. But it was what lay beyond that froze me. A man bound to a chair, eyes open but unfocused, a thin scar running along his temple as if something had been inserted and removed. Holmes examined the figure grimly. "Latham," he said softly. "Do you recognize him?" Latham nodded in horror. "Yes, that's Kellaway." A chill settled over us. Holmes moved closer, inspecting a small metal instrument beside the table. A hollow needle unlike any I'd seen, attached to a series of copper wires leading to a pulse generator. "The needle's path," Holmes murmured. "Their device for altering the very currents of the brain." Before we could react, footsteps echoed above, multiple, deliberate. Holmes extinguished the lantern, motioning us to silence. In the faint flicker of lamplight, his eyes gleamed with fierce calculation. "They know we're here," he whispered. "Watson, this night may yet decide whether the truth of the needle's path ever sees the light of day." The door above groaned open. Shadows shifted along the staircase. Holmes raised his revolver, and in that instant, I saw something rare in his face, not fear but anticipation, the kind that comes only when intellect meets its equal in the dark. Of course, and this will be the final part of Sherlock Holmes and the Needle's Path case, completing the arc with a tightly connected, suspenseful and satisfying resolution. It will preserve the established tone, pacing, and continuity while delivering the revelation and closure worthy of a Holmes mystery. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, each creak of the stair a deliberate warning. Holmes motioned for silence, his revolver poised, his mind already spinning through possibilities. I could almost hear the machinery of his reasoning turning behind those cold, sharp eyes. 3 figures emerged from the stairwell, their faces concealed by masks of dark velvet, the spiral emblem of the needle glinting faintly upon their breastplates. At their head stood a man whose voice, calm and resonant, cut through the silence like a blade. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not lower his weapon. "And yet I imagine you expected I would." The masked man inclined his head slightly. "We did. Curiosity is your vice, as obsession is ours." He stepped closer, and in the lamplight I saw his gloved hand tighten around a walking stick engraved with intricate silver filigree. "Sir Edmund Ashcroft is not missing, Mr. Holmes. He is transformed." "Transformed?" Holmes echoed, his tone as cold as the steel in his hand. "By force of your invention, I presume. The instrument designed to mutilate the very essence of consciousness. You call it enlightenment, but I call it desecration." The man chuckled softly. "Enlightenment and desecration are but 2 words for the same awakening." He gestured toward the inert body of Dr. Kellaway. "He was our first success and our first failure. The human mind, you see, resists perfection." Holmes's voice hardened. "And Ashcroft." "Ah," the man said, his tone almost reverent. "He offered himself willingly. He believed that through pain and precision, the spirit could be refined. The needle's path is not merely a device, it is a philosophy." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me briefly, a signal. Then, without warning, he raised his revolver, not to fire but to shatter one of the oil lamps hanging above. The room plunged into semi-darkness, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. In that confusion, Holmes lunged forward, striking the masked leader across the face with the butt of his weapon. The man staggered backward, his mask torn free, revealing the pallid, sharp features of none other than Sir Edmund Ashcroft himself. I gasped aloud. "Good heavens, Ashcroft!" Holmes pressed his revolver to the man's temple. "Transformed indeed," he said coldly, "though not beyond recognition." Ashcroft laughed, a hollow, brittle sound. "You cannot stop what has begun, Holmes. The mind once opened cannot be closed." Holmes struck him again, not in violence, but to force him still, and tore the metal device from the table, examining it in the dim light. "Watson," he said, "this machine amplifies electrical stimulation directly into the prefrontal cortex, crude yet effective in producing obedience or madness. It appears our philosopher's stone was merely a conduit for control." One of the remaining masked figures lunged toward him. I fired my revolver instinctively, the report echoing like thunder in the confined chamber. The man fell, his mask shattering against the stone floor. Ashcroft's defiance faltered at last, his eyes flickering between Holmes and the fallen acolyte. Holmes stepped closer. "Your order ends tonight. The needle's path will be buried, along with its delusions of transcendence." Ashcroft's lips twisted into a faint smile. "You cannot bury an idea, Holmes." "Then I shall dissect it," Holmes replied coldly. He struck the pulse generator, sending a burst of sparks through the copper wires. The machinery crackled, then erupted in a hiss of smoke and flame. Holmes seized Ashcroft by the collar, dragging him toward the stairs as the chamber filled with choking fumes. Latham and I followed, stumbling upward through the black haze until we burst into the apothecary above, gasping for air. Behind us, the laboratory burned, the infernal device consumed by its own energy. Outside, the fog had thinned, and the distant toll of St. Mary's bell marked the hour before dawn. Holmes stood in the street, his coat torn, his face streaked with soot, watching as the flames devoured the hidden chamber below. Policemen arrived within minutes, summoned by the commotion. Count Lestrade himself took charge of Ashcroft and the surviving cultists. When all was secured, and Latham safely escorted away, Holmes turned to me, his expression weary but composed. "It is over, Watson. Yet even as we destroy their apparatus, the temptation remains. Man's desire to master the mind, his own or another's, is the most perilous pursuit of all." We walked in silence back toward Baker Street, the first light of dawn glimmering upon the cobblestones. The air was sharp, clean, as though London itself sought to purge the night's corruption. Back at the flat, Holmes removed his coat and sat before the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, but I sensed no triumph there, only contemplation. He spoke at last. Ashcroft believed he had found the path to perfection. But in truth, he had only rediscovered an ancient folly, the belief that intellect alone can purify the soul. I nodded quietly. "And you, Holmes, what do you believe?" He smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the light of morning filtered through. "I believe, my dear Watson, that the mind's greatest strength lies not in control but in understanding. That is the true path, though it is far less dazzling than a needle of silver." He leaned back, closing his eyes as the fire crackled softly. Outside, London stirred once more, indifferent to the secrets. It had nearly swallowed whole, and as I watched him, this man of reason, who had walked through madness and returned, I realized that the needle's path had not merely tested the boundaries of science, but the limits of the human will. Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of smoke, and in that calm, steady breath the case was laid to rest.